But all this insightful feedback got me thinking about the whole concept of themes, what they're for, how they come about, and why they're relevant to media criticism. They're not. But you know where themes get mentioned most of all? In responses to legitimate film criticism. A theme is nothing more solid than a simple idea that a movie touches on.
So, you just heard author Will Jordan, aka YouTuber The Critical Drinker, talking about theme. I'm here to tell you that he is lying to you in more ways than one.
Now, maybe lying to you sounds too harsh, but in any case, he is wrong. Much like other right-wing grifters, he's either knowingly lying or he's just ignorant. But before we can talk about how Will lies about theme, we ought to know what theme is, which is genuinely important because it's easy to get theme confused with motif. If you'll allow me to dust off my old English teaching degree, a motif is a recurring idea or object throughout a story, whereas a theme is what the story is truly about.
For example, in the movie Frozen, we have doors as a constant motif, both opened and closed. We obviously can't say that the theme of Frozen is doors, but we can say that the motif of doors contributes to the theme of the story, which is that we need each other and we shouldn't shut one another out.
So when someone says a story has a theme of justice, they're actually talking about a motif. You should never use one word to describe a theme. If we're still using justice as an example, there are a million stories about justice, so what does story A say about justice compared to story B? So for all you English students out there, next time you have to write an essay about a story's theme, remember, it's always going to be more than one word.
It's not enough to say crime and punishment is about justice. You have to argue something more like crime and punishment is about how no single person can take justice into their own hands. The Master's Review explains it really well in writing. Both symbols and motifs lead to a greater understanding of the story's theme, which is the overall message, through line, or lesson generated by the narrative. In fact, lesson or moral of the story are kind of interchangeable terms for theme.
Granted, it's still easy to get theme and motif confused, and you will probably even see me doing it in this video by mistake. But with that in mind, let's now talk about how Will is being dishonest when he talks about theme.
A lot has been said about the drinker lately, I think especially since his ridiculous takes on Peter Parker in Across the Spider-Verse, complaining about emasculating the only straight white man in the narrative by putting him in a pink bathrobe. YouTubers like Pillar of Garbage, Anthony Gramuglia, The Birdman, Movies with Mark, Otterly Noah, and Man Carrying Thing have all taken shots at Will. You might even say they fired at Will. In Man Carrying Thing's video, he even said making a video about the critical drinker was low-hanging fruit, and don't get me wrong, it is, but I still think it's important to make this video.
Back in 2020, for a few short months, I was a regular viewer of The Critical Drinker. Not everything he says is wrong, and I found myself getting sucked in by his commentary. I don't know what eventually pulled me out, maybe some of the grosser statements about women, maybe his defense of Gina Carano, I can't remember for sure. But it would have been nice to have had more videos like what I hope to achieve with this one to highlight where Will is right, but more especially where he's wrong, and why that matters. Before we get started, I should preface by saying that some of my commentary here is going to sound mean. I apologize for that. Keep in mind, I am a very stupid person. I am not always a good critic. I am factually incorrect from time to time, and I have very bad takes here and there. But what I hope I'm not is intellectually dishonest and inconsistent, which I think Will often is. And one last thing before we jump in, this video will contain some spoilers for Midsommar, Thunderbolts, Us, and Nope. Also, a small content warning for brief discussions of depression and suicide. Be advised.
To start, we have to go to his review on Ari Aster's Midsommar. Will's review, Midsommar, the worst movie I've seen all year, is bad, and I'll explain why for various reasons, but first and foremost, he just flat out did not understand the film. He completely misinterpreted it. So, very brief recap. Danny is a college student whose sister took her own life and their parents' lives too. Danny's boyfriend, Christian, was going to break up with her, but with Danny being so grief-stricken, he feels it isn't right anymore. They stay in their poor relationship, and sometime later, Christian's friend Peele takes the whole gang on a trip to his commune in Sweden: Danny, Christian, Mark, and Josh. Some strange and horrifying goings-on start occurring, but Josh and Christian want to stay for their anthropology theses, and Mark wants to stay for a girl in the commune. Of course, it turns out to be a cult, and everyone dies except for Danny, who is sucked into the cult by giving her the illusion of a new family.
To me, the theme of Midsommar is you must take care of yourself, love yourself, and find fulfillment in yourself. If you don't, others will take advantage of you. Another way to put it would be that predators always prey on the most vulnerable. We see this as Dani's inability to overcome her grief and depression pushes her to lean on forces that take advantage of her and don't have her best interests at heart, i.e. Christian and, to a greater extent, the cult.
If you really don't think Will missed the point of the movie, consider how he called it directionless and...
A commercial for the Swedish tourism industry.
Like, huh? And beyond Drinker's overall misreading of the film, there are moments where, like I said up top, I'm not sure if he's ignorant or if he's lying. For example, this bit.
Now this is probably the point at which normal people would realise that all is not well with this place, and that it would be a good idea to gather up your gear, make some polite excuses, and leave.
This is not the only time across these videos where Will insinuates or flat out claims that the characters in Midsommar could just leave anytime they want to. They cannot. They don't have a car and they are miles away from civilization. For all intents and purposes, they are trapped. In fact, the characters of Connie and Simon do try to leave, but it doesn't matter. The cult simply made them disappear and killed them, then lied to the remaining tourists that things were fine. And doesn't it kind of say something about Christian, Mark, and Josh that they don't try to leave? Maybe something about hubris or selfishness, maybe things that would be important to note? In fact, if I remember correctly, Dani suggests they do leave, which, by Will's standards of logic, should make her the most likable character in the movie. But surprise, surprise, he does not like Dani, and we'll talk more about that soon. Let's get back to misinterpretation and dishonesty.
You know how all those old school slasher movies intentionally made their characters dumb and unlikable so you wouldn't feel bad when they got killed, but then it became a total cliche and people generally stopped doing it because it was obvious audience manipulation? Well, could someone please tell that to Ari Aster? He needs to hear it.
The characters aren't unlikable so you're happy when they die. The characters die because they are unlikable. They are selfish and disrespectful, and that is their undoing. And even though they are terrible people, the audience is not meant to cheer on their deaths. Their deaths are meant to be horrific, and they are. Later, once Dani is given the option to sentence Christian to death, Will says,
and they have a long, loving look at each other, and of course, she realises he was coerced into cheating on her under the influence, and he totally wasn't responsible for his own actions, and he's generally a decent man, and so she forgives him. No, I'm just kidding.
So I have to assume that in Will's mind, this is the logical thing that would have and should have happened in reality. But at what point could Christian have explained to her that he was drugged and not in control of himself? How could Dani have known that? From Dani's perspective, it looks like he absolutely did cheat on her, and she has no way of knowing otherwise. I'm not saying Dani's response to kill Christian is right, but I am saying it absolutely makes sense internally on top of all the other manipulation tactics the cult uses throughout the film. Also, calling Christian a generally decent man? Excuse me? Like, sure, he's no murderer cultist, but did you watch the movie, Will? I also have to point out that Will gives a lot of leeway to Christian seeing as he was drugged, but he doesn't very heavily emphasize that Dani was also given plenty of substances and was clearly having a psychotic break. Why has Christian absolved of his actions but Dani isn't?
And Dani smiles because she's empowered or liberated now or something.
I don't know how you look at Midsommar and think it's possibly a movie about female empowerment. What kind of a brain do you have to approach a piece of horror that way? Remember earlier how I said the audience is not supposed to cheer on the deaths of the characters? That would kind of make an audience member just as bad as Dani by the end of the film, no? So it's interesting how Will can instinctively know that it's wrong to want these characters to die, but then think the ending is supposed to be positive for Dani as she appears happy that everyone she knew died. Is Midsommar the best movie ever? Is it perfect? No. I will concede that Midsommar does feel too long at points. Ari Aster clearly wants to make a meal out of his scenes, and while I see the artistry, it just didn't always land for me. But I think the film's length is the only somewhat agreeable point Will makes in the video, the point that doesn't have anything to do with dishonesty or misinterpretation. Want another example?
Character motivations are non-existent. Nobody's really trying to achieve anything in this film.
Huh? I suppose you could argue that Dani, at times, seems like she's not trying to achieve anything, but that's depression, Will. The cry of the depressed person is, what's the point? Now deep down, I do think Dani wants to achieve something. I think she wants to get better and have a family. I believe she's trying to fill the hole that her tremendous loss created, but she's going about it in the wrong way. She is taken advantage of, first by Christian, then by the cult. As for our male leads, Christian and Josh want to exploit the foreign culture for their own educational and career pursuits, while Mark just wants to get laid. These are obviously selfish motivations. Christian also has motivations beyond that. He doesn't want to be a jerk by breaking up with Danny in her time of need. By that same token, Danny doesn't want to break up with Christian because she feels she needs him. This too is a type of selfishness, but not the typical puffed up, arrogant kind. It's the kind of selfishness where you think you're doing what's best for you. You're too clouded and fearful to really make the best decision for yourself and, in this case, the other person in your relationship. At the very beginning of the film, Danny's friend is not so subtly trying to tell her that Christian is bad for her, but Danny just can't see it that way. Peele's motivations become super clear. He wants to achieve the cult's ends by killing his friends and brainwashing Danny. Again, I don't know how you watch this movie and have the takeaway that Will does, but that's not his only bad take on character.
But Danny is a complete wet rag. She's sad and distant and kind of unstable, and that's pretty much how she stays throughout the film. There's no redemption, no growth, no revelations.
First of all, Will, you're contradicting yourself. You said that Danny was empowered by the end of the movie, so by your own interpretation, she did absolutely go on a character journey. But again, you're misinterpreting. You would think a writer would have heard of negative character arcs before.
And why does this movie act as if Christian somehow deserves what happened to him?
It doesn't. What are you talking about, dude? That's the horror of it, that Danny killed someone who was not worthy of death, someone she used to love. It shows us just how far bad actors can go when they target people who are unstable.
I guess this is what empowered female characters look like now.
In your eyes, I suppose that's true, Mr. Subjective Drinker. In his overall thoughts on the movie, he says,
It has absolutely nothing valuable to say about anything.
What do you want your movies to say, Will? Like, honestly? Because based on the way you critique other movies, I feel like a movie that has nothing to say about anything would actually be up your alley. No, the truth is, you don't think this movie has nothing to say. You just think what this movie does have to say is too woke.
Thankfully, the top comments on this video pointed out what Will missed. I think the movie manipulated even some of the audience. To say that a mentally unstable girl got her revenge, that Christian's death was well-deserved, that they like Peele because he actually loves her, to hear all of that frightens me at how a vast majority of people really are not in their right minds at all. I think they would be easily manipulated into joining a cult. I thought it was pretty obvious that the whole movie is about the main character being sucked into the cult, and that the ending isn't meant to be positive. There were so many people who thought Danny had a happy ending, and I'm like, how is being broken down and brainwashed by a cult happy exactly? The ending wasn't supposed to be liberating. Danny smiled because she had been manipulated to stay in the cult. It was a really horrifying ending and nothing to celebrate over. The fact that some of you people believe the film ended on a liberating note is terrifying to me. That means that the film effectively brainwashed you just like the cult brainwashed the vulnerable protagonist. These comments go on.
Also, throughout this review, I have to question if Will is like, even a human being. Like, does he know what empathy is, let alone feel it? He seems completely unable to understand how Danny would still be heartbroken over the loss of her family after 6 months. He can't seem to piece together why Christian would want to stay with her under those circumstances. Like, dude, put yourself in the shoes of another human being for half a second. I thought you were a writer.
There are other claims in this video worthy of debunking, and other people have, but ultimately I cut those bits because they're not as relevant to our actual discussion at hand. You can see other people tear into this review if you want, but I think I've made my point, that being how Will woefully misinterpreted this movie.
Looking at this video reminded me of something Cody Johnston once said. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, it takes seconds for these grifters to spew lies, and in turn, it takes minutes to debunk them.
But that's going to take us into Will's next video in this saga, How Not to Critique Movies.
Will must have been a little miffed by the comments disagreeing with him on the Midsommar video, so he decided to follow up with a response about why he was right actually, and everyone else was wrong. He opens with this alleged comment from the video.
Drinker, you loquacious hypothesizer. I'm afraid your criticism of this movie is totally invalid. Midsommar is about the breakdown of a relationship. It deals with complex themes like the loss of mutual friends, the grief and sadness of being betrayed by someone close to you, and the desire to take revenge, ultimately leading to tragedy and heartbreak.
Now, look. I'm not saying Will made up this comment. There are many reasons why you wouldn't just take a screenshot of the original. For example, if you don't want your audience to go harassing the commenter. But setting aside whether or not that's something he would do, and assuming the comment is real for a moment, why would he choose this comment specifically? I have to imagine there were many other comments disagreeing with his take, but this was the one he chose. Well, notice that while this comment does deal with the idea of themes, it doesn't tell Drinker directly that he misinterpreted the movie, its themes, its ending, and Danny's character arc. If this comment is real, it is a perfect comment for Will to respond to, because it doesn't actually prove him wrong. For one thing, I don't really think Midsommar is about the loss of mutual friends or the desire to take revenge. There is a stronger case that it's about being betrayed by someone close to you, what with Danny and her sister, and technically you could make the argument that the movie is about mutual friends or about revenge. I don't think that reading would hold up very well, but you could still try to make the argument. The point is, if this comment is real, it doesn't actually address the biggest problem with Will's review, which makes it the perfect springboard for the point he's about to make. Will outright directly claims that themes are not relevant to media criticism, and I'm not putting words in his mouth when I say that.
But all this insightful feedback got me thinking about the whole concept of themes, what they're for, how they come about, and why they're relevant to media criticism. They're not. But you know where themes get mentioned most of all? In responses to legitimate film criticism.
Right, because the Midsommar review was so legitimate. Pray tell, Will. What is legitimate film criticism? What do you know? He doesn't tell us. Okay, that's not entirely fair. Later in the video, he lists plot structure, internal consistency, and character development as metrics to judge film. But what were the inconsistencies in Midsommar? Genuinely, what were they? Do the characters act all that inconsistent? I don't think so. Was Danny's turn really all that inconsistent with everything we saw up to that point? Again, I don't think so. And what exactly was the issue with the plot structure besides perhaps being a little slow? Funny how the video does not really address these things, nor does it address Will's wrong interpretation in the first place. It really feels like he's dancing around the actual problems here.
Picking out the theme of a movie is a bit like looking for shapes in the clouds. Everyone sees something a little different, and what you see depends a lot on your own point of view.
This is true, I can't dispute this claim. For example, Will has such a point of view that he can't see a movie with a female protagonist where she smiles at the end and not interpret it as a feminist film. What an odd point of view to prescribe to a movie like Midsommar, Will. And frankly, it's not just Midsommar. Listen to this bit from his review of Marvel's Thunderbolts.
The movie begins with discount Black Widow who's feeling sad and worthless because there's not much going on in her life outside of her work. And if that's not a neat encapsulation of modern feminism, frankly, I don't know what is.
Now you may think, Jonah, come on, that's clearly a joke. And maybe it is. Because the Drinker is a character, Will always has the potential mask of, oh, it wasn't me who said that, it was the Drinker. I was exaggerating and being hyperbolic as a performance. It's literally just Nick Kroll's character from Parks and Rec. It's Schrodinger's douchebag. But let's keep watching.
John Walker exists for no other reason than to be wrong about everything and constantly mocked and belittled by the strong female characters around him.
Was that a joke too? The bit that was in the serious critical section of the video? Isn't it interesting how Will keeps seeing these Florence Pugh movies and prescribing a feminist message onto them? Once again, commenters called him out for this poor reading of the movie.
Bro actually just called female depression feminism. John Walker exists to be wrong about everything. John literally gets him, Yelena, and Bob out of the facility they were in after Yelena's plan failed. Also, how is Yelena feeling that her life has no purpose relate to modern-day feminism? Many people, men included, get depressed from feeling like they have nothing in life to look forward to. Drinker was more concerned about delivering his message than this film was about the message.
Also, Will says that Florence Pugh is way above movies like Thunderbolts. First of all, Florence Pugh turns in an amazing performance in that movie, even if she is above it. Second of all, what has he even seen her in besides this and Midsommar? Oppenheimer? The only thing he has to say about her in that movie is that her scenes felt awkward. I think he liked Dune Part 2, but he called Pugh superfluous in that movie. Has he seen Lady Macbeth, or We Live in Time, or Little Women? If so, he hasn't reviewed them. I wonder why. But sorry to deviate so hard. Back to the theme video where Will asserts that looking for themes can be like cloud watching in the sense that point of view is a big factor. Will attempts to show why this is such a bad thing by satirically saying that Midsommar is actually about the war in Afghanistan.
A coalition of Americans and Brits enter into a foreign country full of high hopes and overconfidence, but their lack of understanding of the local population causes them to get bogged down in a situation they didn't plan for. Soon casualties start to mount, and their superior technology fails to win the day for them.
You get the picture. What's funny is that he's actually hitting on some of the salient points of the movie while making fun of those who would want to read into it. For example, the character's overconfidence and lack of understanding. When it comes to interpretation, it is absolutely possible to gather up all the right pieces, but put them in an improper order. But here comes the real crux of Will's argument.
And if every interpretation is equally valid, then every interpretation is equally
That's just the thing. That is where the argument falls apart. No serious critic or interpreter of art would ever say that all interpretations are equally valid. As any English teacher will tell you, some interpretations stand up to scrutiny better than others. A prime example would be Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ode to the West Wind. With all the religiously charged language here, you could interpret this poem from a Christian lens. Knowing that this poem was written shortly after the death of Shelley's son, a reader would be tempted to see this as a come-to-Jesus moment. But that would be a pretty tremendous misreading, seeing as Percy was always an atheist. No, the poem's text doesn't communicate a reverence towards God, but a reverence towards nature and the natural order. The idea that good will always come again, that spring will always follow winter, both literally and metaphorically. You could make the argument that Thunderbolts is a feminist film, that the theme of the movie is how empowered women can save men from dark circumstances, but that reading probably wouldn't stand up to scrutiny against other readings that normal moviegoers can very easily see. The theme of Thunderbolts is very clearly how we can't do it all alone. We need each other in this world to combat how dark and aimless it can be sometimes. We need family, whether a blood family or a found family. But even though Will really loves to be wrong about theme and then use those wrong themes to criticize a movie, he has a real problem with theme in general.
A theme is nothing more solid than a simple idea that a movie touches on.
Hard disagree. Like I said up top, that sounds more like a motif to me, a recurrent object or idea. A theme is much more than that. It's what the story is actually about at its heart. Will then compares The Shining against Midsommar, and one of his major points here is that The Shining works because the characters are sympathetic and likable. But tell me, Will, why is Danny not sympathetic or likable? Can you tell me that? I'm genuinely not sure if you can without sounding extremely heartless. Don't get me wrong, you can make the argument that Danny is unlikable, you can even make the argument that she's unsympathetic, but I don't think you can make those arguments without revealing something about yourself in the process. And perhaps that's why Will is so scared of theme and analysis, because he doesn't want to engage in self-examination. Will goes on to lie about Midsommar again with claims such as, if the characters weren't so stupid they could have escaped. Which is just factually incorrect, but I won't continue harping on it. Again, other folks have.
Is fair and objective analysis now some crazy outdated idea to be abandoned, instead of a goal to aspire to?
What is fair and objective analysis, Will? Can you imagine looking at a movie the way Will does? In fact, let's take a movie that I think Will actually likes and look at it through his lens. In the movie Terminator 2 Judgment Day, it sure is convenient how our main characters all end up at a steel mill at the end of the movie, the exact place they'd need to be in order to defeat the T-1000. And thank goodness this steel mill doesn't actually conform to the realities of steel mills in our real world. If there were that much molten steel actually exposed, it would have burned the characters up just through proximity. And that Sarah Connor character, what was her issue? Why did she become so emotionally unstable and violent? Why did she make such a big deal about her son? He's fine. And when the T-800 had to prove to Miles that he was from the future, why did he just rip all his synthetic skin off his arm? Seems pretty impractical when there are surely other ways to prove the truth of the matter to him. I could keep going. All you have to do is play dumb, drain yourself of empathy, and for good measure go to the Goofs page for whatever movie on IMDb. Of course, despite all his talk, Will shields himself at the end of this video by adding,
It's not to say that I don't have any interest in a movie's themes. I mean, I even talk about it myself at times when I think it's relevant, but I never allow that to influence my overall opinion of the film.
Will, when is it relevant to mention themes? Whenever you do it? Are you the end-all be-all on when themes are relevant to film review? That is awfully convenient that you know when they're relevant but nobody else does, and equally convenient that you can correctly interpret a movie's themes while other people just can't. Rules for thee, but not for me, eh, Will? If inconsistency, plot structure, and characters are the metrics by which to judge movies, then Will should be very concerned with theme, because a movie's plot, characters, and consistency all have to do with its core theme, and vice versa.
There are so many movies we could turn to on this, like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. That movie opens with Cassie trying to stand up for people in protest and being arrested for it. Scott chastises her for this, and the audience naturally thinks, oh, this is what the movie will be about, standing up for the little guy. But then, because of the movie's inconsistencies, as well as its lack of character arcs, and the plot's insistence on setting up Kang instead of actually telling the chosen story, the movie isn't really about that at all. The most egregious inconsistency there was in the theme itself. The movie didn't know what it wanted to say or be. These are the movies we will not remember, the movies that clearly have nothing to say. Or you could also take a movie like Lady Ballers, which is supposed to be a movie about why gender divides are good, but then becomes a movie about why we should still have segregation, I guess.
You can call me uncharitable there, and yeah, I'm exaggerating a little, but my point is Lady Ballers undermines itself and its attempted message because of the plot issues, sloppy or non-existent character arcs, and inconsistencies.
For more on that, I'd recommend Some More News' video on the movie. It's a thorough and well-written breakdown.
My point is, theme is inextricably tied to a story's quality, either by saying that a story is weak because it's about nothing, which Will tried to say in his first Midsommar video, or by saying that a story is weak because its execution doesn't deliver the intended message, which I think Will also tried to say in his first Midsommar video.
A month after this video on themes, Will released a video about Jordan Peele's Us, reiterating his stance on how themes shouldn't matter in film criticism. The movie Us follows Adelaide Wilson and her family as abandoned government clones start to rise up over the US, killing their original counterparts. These clones call themselves the Tethered. They were made in underground laboratories and were designed initially to be linked to their above-ground originals as a means of controlling them. Addie and her family managed to kill their counterparts, while several other clones successfully managed to kill their other halves. But, twist, as it turns out, the Addie that we knew was the real clone, having replaced her above-world version long ago, which ultimately triggered the original Addie to lead the clone uprising later.
Now briefly, let's address the fact that Us is not a perfect movie. I think it's for sure the weakest in Peele's horror trio. Its attempted explanation in the third act does create some confusion the more you start to think about it. But is Us a bad movie? Personally, I would say no, in large part because the central metaphor works pretty well. I actually enjoy Us more than Midsommar, but that's besides the point. Let's hear what Will has to say about Us.
What comes to mind when you think of your favourite horror movies? Whatever it might be, it's probably not going to be a subversive exploration of contemporary American socio-political issues.
I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, Will, but horror has pretty much always been political. Dracula is commentary on immigrants, xenophobia, and vaccines. Frankenstein is commentary on nature versus nurture, scientific progress, religion, gender, birth, abortion, and much, much more.
I've brought up this Stan Lee quote before, but I think it's relevant here. From time to time, we receive letters from readers who wonder why there's so much moralizing in our mags. They take great pains to point out that comics are supposed to be escapist reading and nothing more. But somehow, I can't see it that way. It seems to me that a story without a message, however subliminal, is like a man without a soul. In fact, even the most escapist literature of all, old-time fairy tales and heroic legends, contained moral and philosophical points of view. At every college campus where I may speak, there's as much discussion of war and peace, civil rights, and the so-called youth rebellion as there is of our Marvel mags, per se. None of us lives in a vacuum. None of us is untouched by the everyday events about us, events which shape our stories just as they shape our lives. Sure, our tales can be called escapist, but just because something's for fun doesn't mean we have to blanket our brains while we read it.
Basically, as Stan said, all stories are political, or at least have a message, because none of us exist in a vacuum. But again, for the drinker, messages are bad.
A movie so overcome with its own message that it forgets how it's actually being delivered.
Never in this video does Will actually attempt to say what the message of Us is. Maybe he learned his lesson with Midsommar and realized he was just bad at interpreting movies, or maybe he knows that if he does explain the message behind Us, his audience might realize it's actually not a bad allegory. He gets close when he says the movie
Explores the dichotomy of American society between the rich and the privileged upper classes and the ignored and marginalized minorities. Get f***ed.
But that's not entirely it. Also, a pretty weak counterargument to just say, get f***ed. But regardless, a lot of people criticize Us for its ending, saying it would be a much better movie if it was left ambiguous as to whether Addie was the clone or not. But for my money, I think it's absolutely necessary that the narrative confirms the truth of the matter. The theme of Us is that you cannot get ahead in America without putting somebody else down, including yourself. If you want to advance in capitalist America, then there's a part of yourself you're going to have to bury, the part of yourself that would be fair and generous toward other people. And in part, this is absolutely about race. White people have gotten ahead in this country by keeping non-white people down, largely black folks and Native Americans. But even as a black person, you cannot get ahead in the US unless you put down other black people. That is the system the white elites set up. As another example, read Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, a book about the prejudices of black people toward other black people. Oh, and wouldn't you know it, the daughter in Us is named Zora. Huh, what a coincidence. Oftentimes, Will's style of criticism is just asking a lot of logistical questions about the movie. In the case of Us, some of these questions are valid, some are even kind of funny, others are debunkable, and some of them are just really frustrating. For example,
why is the Hands Across America thing played out like it has some deep philosophical meaning? It was just the logo on her t-shirt.
I cannot imagine thinking about a narrative this uncritically.
The thing about Hands Across America is that it failed. It was an actual attempt to create a contiguous chain of people across the continental United States while also donating to charity. But not only did the chain literally fail with too few participants, especially in rural areas, but the campaign itself raised far less money than it hoped to, demonstrating again how those who are stepped on remain kept down, despite anyone's best efforts.
It was only an act of conscious rebellion that made the Hands Across America work in Us. And perhaps true class consciousness is the only thing that will unite Americans at this point. Only when Americans come together without stepping on each other can they accomplish something. Of course, that's where the movie breaks down a little bit beyond the suspension of disbelief, because even though the tethered united, they did still have to take in order to achieve. They felt they had to kill their originals in order to reach their ends. Granted, you could argue that Peele is saying something about the necessary lengths of class warfare and class revolution. Like I said, it's not a perfect movie, and notice how some of the inconsistencies affect the theme and vice versa. But listen to what Will has to say toward the end of this video.
A lot of the individual elements of this film are actually pretty good. Us gives us a decent cast of mostly interesting, down-to-earth characters who react and make decisions like real people would in that situation. I liked them, and I found myself rooting for them to succeed and concerned when they were in danger. Likewise, performances are solid across the board, especially Winston Duke as Gabe, who's funny and relatable and provides some much-needed levity.
The praise goes on, so it sounds to me like Will actually liked the movie a lot, but might be too afraid to say it because he knows the movie is trying to deliver a politically progressive message, one that is at least partially tied to race. I just feel that personally it's disingenuous to say you loved the characters and were concerned for them, but then turn around and say you didn't like the story. The characters are the story, dude. And what's also kind of funny is that one of Us's biggest weaknesses is how it becomes clear that none of the family members will die, pretty much erasing the stakes. But whatever.
That'll bring us to our last video here, Will's review of Nope.
But quickly, as an aside, I was almost positive The Drinker also had a negative review of Get Out, but I couldn't find it. Maybe I watched a separate video on Get Out back when I was a fan of his, one that was negative, but I genuinely cannot remember. And let me be clear, I'm not saying any of this to hold against Will because I can't prove any of it. In reality, I'm giving these details because I want to ask you, viewers, is any of this ringing a bell? Did The Drinker have a video on Get Out that he deleted? Anyway, back to his video on Nope.
In the movie Nope, OJ and Emerald own a horse farm where the horses are trained for show business. But some weird things start happening as it seems a UFO is terrorizing the farm and the surrounding area. But it's not, in fact, a spacecraft. No, it's a creature, eating up everything it lifts off the ground. OJ and Emerald want evidence of the UFO, knowing such evidence would come with fame, fortune, and notoriety.
This video from Will is interesting because not only does he consider theme a positive when reviewing the movie, but he actually interprets the movie almost perfectly, in my opinion. But then he goes on to say the themes are muddled.
If I was going to be generous, I'd say that it's a film about our collective obsession with spectacle, money-making and exploitation, especially when it comes to media.
There's more to it than that, and Will does say a little more, but yeah, that's pretty much it. The pursuit of fame and spectacle is self-destructive. It's OJ's humility and respect for the creature that saves him and M. So if Will nailed the interpretation here, How is it muddled?
The only problem, though, is that getting there means turning off the logic and common sense parts of your brains for the majority of the film.
No, I really don't think it does. And even Drinker's audience disagreed with him on this one.
Some of them offered answers to his questions, while others said that they didn't need answers to all of the questions, and Will actually liked a lot of these comments, which to me shows he actually kind of knew he was off on this one. I especially want to highlight this commenter who said, "I appreciate movies that don't spoon-feed you every detail and are willing to leave some reasonable gaps in the story." I say this a lot on the second channel, but it's a hard line to walk, knowing just how much information is enough to give your audience.
And frankly, I think if Will perfectly understood and communicated what Nope was about, then Nope gave pretty much all that it had to. So what was the point of all this? Why did I want to make this video? Odds are good that if you're watching this video, and especially if you've made it this far in the video, you already know that Will is a bad faith, lying, disingenuous critic. But I do think this kind of critique is important to talk about because it seems to communicate that analyzing art is intrinsically invaluable. It feels like an extension of the whole blue curtains meme. This meme would suggest that thinking critically about a work is unproductive, especially when the critical thinking goes beyond potential authorial intent. If you know me, you know I obviously disagree. For me, thinking about a book, poem, movie, TV show, or song is where so much of the fun comes from. I don't simply watch a movie and then wipe my hands, put it out of my mind, and move on. No. And I know Will feels the same way. Why else would he even be a film critic? Like, in the Midsommar video, Will makes fun of the characters for being anthropology students. But Will, my guy, you're in the humanities. Do you have any idea how lucky people like you and I are to be making money talking about art on YouTube? And yeah, maybe talking about art doesn't provide the same value to society that being a doctor does, and it certainly doesn't always pay the bills, but isn't it ultimately what makes us human? All this to say, if you want to prescribe your own interpretations to art, please do not let people like the critical drinker stop you. Even if your interpretation is deeply personal and not what the artist intended, I think there is still value in communicating it. Thinking about it is valuable, I swear to you. It is as human as creating art itself. So don't you dare stop.
And hey, if you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can see videos early, have access to the community Discord, and get priority review for your work over on the second channel. If you want to support me in non-monetary ways, liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, and even just watching my videos really does go a long way. Huge thanks to you for watching, and an extra huge thanks to my patrons. I couldn't do this without them, and as always, I truly can't thank them enough. Follow me on my socials if you want, and please share all your thoughts with me in the comments down below. Ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft.
Whew, this video was hard to make. Each of Will's videos are like 8 to 12 minutes, but they all genuinely feel like an hour each. There is so much summary, like far more summary than analysis, and just all the lies and his speech and his cadence, it's just... Man, if I never see another Drinker video again, it'll be too soon.